Welcome everybody. My name's Sarah Bailey. This is Mark Brandi, man of the moment. I'd just like to start this evening by acknowledging that we're meeting today on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of this land. I acknowledge any First Nations people with us today, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd also like to kick off the evening by just telling you all a little bit about Mark. I'm pretty sure most of you are probably familiar with at least some of his work. But Mark Brandi's best-selling novel, Wimmera, won the coveted British Crime Writers Association debut Dagger and was named Best Debut at the 2018 Australian Indie Book Awards. That was just after we met, I think, Mark. It was also shortlisted for the Australian Book Industry Awards Literary Fiction Book of the Year and the Matt Rochelle Award for New Writer of the Year, so suffice to say his career got off to a pretty cracking start. Mark's second novel, The Rip, was published to critical acclaim in 2019, and his third novel, The Others, was shortlisted for the Best Fiction Prize in the 2022 Ned Kelly Awards. His fourth novel, which is what we're here to talk mainly about this evening, is Southern Aurora, and was just published last week. Mark has had a big variety of work published in publications like The Guardian, The Age, The Big Issue, and in journals both here and overseas, and his writing is also sometimes heard on ABC Radio National. Before he was a full-time writer, Mark graduated with a criminal justice degree and worked in the justice system before changing direction and writing full-time. Originally from Italy, he grew up in rural Victoria, which is the setting of many of his books, which we'll talk about a bit this evening, and he now lives in Melbourne and is working on his next novel, which we'll also talk a little bit about.
Great.
Just a few other kind of housekeeping bits and pieces. This event is presented in partnership with the Melbourne City Reads series. The Melbourne City Reads series is generously supported by George and Rosa Mortson. Our bookseller tonight is the Hill of Content Bookshop, and they are selling copies of Southern Aurora, so please buy a copy if you haven't already. They're down the back on my right. And if you have already bought a copy, then buy another one and give it to someone as a gift. Mark will be available to sign copies on my left after our conversation. And don't forget too, Mark's written 3 other novels, so if you haven't read them, bought them as well. Plenty of time to get onto that in the next couple of weeks too. So, Mark.
Sarah.
Mark and I are friends outside of this type of situation, and so normally I grill him in private over dinner and things like that. So I'm pretty excited to be able to grill him in public this evening and force him to answer my questions. But I thought I would kick off by, I guess, Mark, I was thinking about this sort of earlier in the week when we were talking about this event. You're like a 40-year-old-ish man. I'm trying to start with a compliment. Around about 40. But yet you write books from the perspective of young people.
Yes.
And so I guess I wanted to start by talking about that first. Jimmy, for those of you who haven't read Southern Aurora already, is the beating heart of this book. And you've had other children characters lead the way in your other novels. There was Ben and Fab in Wimmera, Jacob in The Others. So this is sort of a two-parter question, but I guess firstly, why do you choose to often write in the voice of a child? And then how do you get into that headspace and write so convincingly in the voice of a child?
Thanks, Sarah.
You're welcome.
In some ways I think probably my psychologist could answer that better than what I can, why I keep writing kids. But it wasn't really, it's not a conscious thing for me. When I wrote Wimmera, my first book, and Ben and Fab in that story, that was sort of reflecting, I guess, directly on some of my experiences growing up in country Victoria. And, in the writing of Jimmy, it was a very different kind of exercise. I suppose one of the great things I find with writing a younger perspective is that there is this kind of tension between the reader and the character to some degree, because hopefully the reader is, I think, becoming a little bit protective over the character sometimes, and will, as an adult reader, be reading a little bit ahead, saying, don't go there, don't do this, or whatever the case may be. So there's a kind of tension you can play with there. You know, I'd probably start off with voice is the main thing for me. So when I started writing Southern Aurora, it was back in 2015. So it was like after I'd finished Wimmera. Wimmera hadn't been published yet, hadn't been picked up by a publisher yet. And I started writing this story, and it actually began as a short story initially. So it was a story of a kid who his dog comes to an unfortunate end, and that was kind of inspired by some events from my youth. It was a fictionalised account, and it's a bit like all my stories in this way, that there'll be something there, there'll be something in it that I want to explore further. Yep. and know something more about their situation. There'll be something kind of nagging away at me, something unclear, I suppose. And the writing of the novel then becomes my sort of search for clarity about that character and their situation. And so hopefully when it's done and a reader picks it up, the reader goes on that journey, quote unquote, with you, to arrive at a position of clarity. Now, what that kind of clarity is varies for every reader. So I don't try to be prescriptive about that, and I try to leave enough room for a reader to enter a narrative and kind of draw their own inferences as well. The second part of your question about the process, I guess, of going into that view, it's I don't know. It's hard. I found The Others and my third book and the perspective of Jacob. That was a really hard world to inhabit because it was this very claustrophobic environment on this isolated farm. Jimmy's story was very different because he's a really optimistic kid who's in some very difficult circumstances, and I really enjoyed writing this story. I enjoyed it probably more than any of my other books, I would have to say. So, yeah, every story is different, and I suppose I'm just trying to honour that character's story in that point in time in their lives, and in some ways I think about them kind of going on after the book is finished and sort of having their own life and their own existence in the world, and they become very, very real to me, which is probably, I don't know if I'm sort of strange like that. I don't know if that's your experience as well, but yeah, my characters become very real.
I've actually got your psychologist on the line. No, I don't.
She's here tonight, actually.
No, so I was going to say, though, with writing from the voice of children, which I've not really done that. I think I've done it in a few little chapters and things in my books. But is it a little bit different from writing in the voice of an adult? I mean, you'd never get asked about writing in the voice of an adult because that's kind of the default, I suppose. But because they've had shorter lives and there's less experience in those characters, you know, maybe they're 8, they're 10, they're 12, there's sort of a similarity to children that you're making sure that you're sort of, I guess, establishing for the reader. So, you know, all children have the similarity of being a child and being at the start or the sort of first few years of their life. So they've got sort of a similar innocence to them. And then you've also got to then layer on top of what is, to your point, their circumstance and what makes them the kid that's dealing with whatever has sort of been served up to them. How do you sort of get your bearings in terms of, you've got, you know, multiple children characters in your novels now. They are all really distinctive, but they are also all really clearly kids, and that comes across really clearly. Do you sort of feel like you have to, I guess, set up the characters and work out in your own mind who they are first, or do you just write and it's really instinctive?
It's probably the latter. Yeah. I just write them. There's something I think too as well, having the constraint of a child's voice when you're writing. So they've got a limited vocabulary, a limited wisdom about the world, and understanding of what's going on. So I like having that constraint when I'm writing. there's also like a degree of tension between them and the adults in their midst, you know. So often when kids are kind of studying adults around them, the motivations of the adults is really inscrutable to them. They're just dealing with what they're being told and trying to make some sort of sense of it, and trying to navigate what is sometimes a scary world. And it unfortunately is a scary world for my characters in my books, and for Jimmy in this latest book. But I suppose I really kind of, I do see the world through their eyes when I'm writing the book. And so it doesn't, I have a fairly full picture in my mind of the sort of children they are, you know, when I start out. How I get to that point, I don't really know. You know, it's a long process. It's a long process of procrastination and just jotting things down about what I think this story might be about, or fragments of conversation. I read this great description recently of the artistic process, and this person was a visual artist, and they were talking about sketching, and when they start off sketching, they'll often find that those sketches will sort of contain the genetic code for the larger work that they want to do. And I find that with my writing too. Those first few things that I'm jotting down, there's something in there that will form the basis of the rest of the story, and I've just got to kind of unearth that. Yeah. So, you know, that's kind of the very esoteric description of the process. But this one, like, as I said, I started it in 2015. I got it to a point where I thought it was sort of finished, but it wasn't doing the things that I wanted it to do. So I ended up just sticking it in the bottom drawer. And it was only really after my next two books were published and during the lockdowns here in Melbourne that I went back to this manuscript, and I thought, you know, I think I can find a way to make this work now. And so whether that was partly a bit of life experience and also writing experience too, that you hope you become more adept as you go along.
Yeah. And just in terms of like, once the alchemy part's over and the sort of that magical first draft is done, is a lot of your editing feedback and conversations about getting the voice of a child right, or it's actually not really about that? You sort of nail that the first time.
Yeah, I sort of nailed that the first time. I don't get much feedback about that, to be honest. I get most feedback about plot. Yeah. Because plot for me is just an afterthought, really. Yeah. Like, it's more about the characters and their voice and their situation and their interactions, and also what is left off the page as well. Is really important. So it's really, when I hand over my manuscript to the publisher and to my fantastic publisher, Vanessa Radnage at Hachette, most of her input is about plot, you know, about sort of ramping it up a little bit, I think. So, it's a great relationship that we have.
Yeah, plot's hard. Plot's tricky.
You're good at plot, though.
Oh, no, it's a nightmare. So this is sort of another two-parter question, but if just sort of following on from...
I need a pen and paper to keep track of your two-part
I'm sorry. It's all right. I'll remind you. I guess with the world of Southern Aurora, which is what I want to talk about next, and the world building of that, I guess, when you're writing from the perspective of a child, it kind of struck me that Southern Aurora is really interesting because we're seeing it through Jimmy's eyes. We do see the big picture. We see, you know, the setting and the town and the people and the big plot story points that he sees. But because he's a kid, you also see these granular things that bother and worry him. And it's really, I guess it's really charming because as a kid, he's worried about the big things, but he's also worried about these little things like the race, you know, that they get involved in. So my question's really about the world building aspect of your novels, and how do you create the place, like both the physical place, the setting, and decide where you want to set your novels, but also how do you sort of put together the pieces of the plot? Because as you say, your books are so character driven, but the plot needs to sort of, I guess, work out the best way of bringing those characters to life in the best possible way that you can. So how do you plot your stories? Is it done afterwards, once you've kind of laid out the characters? How do you choose where you want to set your books?
Yeah.
I know most of them have been set in regional towns. Only one, I think, has been set in a city, in the RIP.
City, yeah.
Why is that, and how does that kind of work out to be the best place for your characters to live?
So Southern Aurora is set in this fictional town of Mittagunda, which I thought sounded like an Australian town. I just made up that name.
I checked that it wasn't real, actually.
Yeah, I had to check that it wasn't. I Googled. And it's halfway between Melbourne and Sydney, which is really important actually to the plot, because there is this train, the titular Southern Aurora, that runs between and used to run between Sydney and Melbourne. I think from the 60s through to the mid-1980s, where this book is set. And that train takes on a particular symbolism for Jimmy, because it represents, I suppose, something outside of the town that he is living in and the circumstances that he finds himself in. It represents something new and different. It goes to Sydney, to Melbourne. That'd be amazing to go to those places. And in some ways that was reflective of some of my childhood too, growing up in Western Victoria, because there used to be a train, or I think it still is running, the overland that ran between Melbourne and Adelaide, and I used to think that train was really cool. Like when I was a kid, it had sleeper carriages and all this sort of stuff. And I think particularly in that era too, pre-internet, life, and it can still be very isolating in country towns, but certainly back then, the city is a million miles away, and for Jimmy and his familial situation, which is quite disadvantaged. His mum has issues with alcohol, her work is very precarious, single parent, they're living in a housing commission property. Life isn't that easy for them. And so where they are located geographically becomes very important to the story. In terms of how I fill out those details, I suppose having grown up in that kind of not in that environment particularly, but in a country town, I have, I guess, some understanding of what that is like, and particularly in that era. And one of the great things of being a published author too is that I've visited a hell of a lot of small country towns, stayed a lot in very bad motor inns around the place when I've done library events. And yeah, there's something different about every town, but there's also something very alike about every town too. And one of the things I think that I try to bring out in my stories that are set in rural areas is that kind of claustrophobia which can exist in country places, which I think if you live in the city, if you ever lived in the country, it's hard to grasp that in some ways, because in small towns, kind of everyone knows who you are and knows something about you, and if they don't know anything about you, they'll make it up, basically. So there's a lot of gossip in small towns, so it can be really hard to escape what people think about you, whatever judgments they make about you. And this is true of Jimmy's predicament and something that his older brother later in the story sort of talks to him about. If you stay in this town, everyone's going to say you're from the avenue, everyone's going to think you're no good because you're my brother, and all this sort of stuff. So that's kind of, I guess, the atmosphere that I'm trying to evoke. What was the second part of your question?
Well, I've got more of a comment, because I think, it's really interesting that you focus in a lot in your books on that the sort of the confinement of wide open spaces.
Yep.
It's invisible claustrophobia because it's actually very open and free.
Yeah.
But there's an invisible trapping of a lot of your characters.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I know from my own experience, and this book isn't thinly veiled memoir. It's a fictional
Cross my other
work.
question off.
Yeah. But it's like coming to the city. For me, was like, wow, it's like great to come to an exciting place. But one of the most exciting things about it was just to be anonymous, because like our family, we ran the local pub, so everyone knew who we were. So it's great to come to a place when no one knows who you are.
It's a lot of pressure almost, because you're so kind of familiar with everybody.
Yeah, being in Truman Show or something. But it's there's great aspect. I don't want to present some really jaundiced view of country life too, because it was a great place to grow up, and I try to bring some of that joy and some of that freedom of childhood to the writing of my characters in Wimmera and also in Southern Aurora. I've tried to infuse that into the story because I certainly had a wonderful childhood growing up in a country town and all the freedom that entailed, and that sort of bucolic cliche of being let out the front door in the morning and your parents don't care where you are or what you're doing as long as you're back by dark. It was a wonderful experience.
And just in terms of my other kind of part of the question, I guess with The Rip, that was based in Melbourne. Did you find writing that book really different from writing your other books that have been set in country towns, or is it just the place that character needed to be and therefore sort of the same experience?
Yeah, it was pretty much the same, because it was really about the character and her worldview, but also the realities of what she was dealing with day to day, because The Rip, for those who haven't read it, is about a woman named Danny who's she's living on the streets. She's dealing with drug addiction and just living day to day. And it started really with voice and character. And the first line that I wrote in that story became the first line of the book, and it just it was weird. That came out much more easily than my other stories, which I've probably got more of a background and more of a personal history in. But The Rip, I really, it came out so quickly, that book.
It's interesting. It's just, how all of the different stories come to be. Characters in Southern Aurora. So we've talked a little bit about Jimmy, and as I said at the start, he's the central, character. He's the absolute sort of heart of the story. But he is also existing within a cast of amazing characters. So there's his mother that you mentioned is struggling with her own sort of issues. He's got an older brother, Mick. He's got another brother called Sam. He's got a stepfather sort of figure in Charlie. There's a friend, Danny, and another friend, Luke Chadwick. And then there's kind of peripheral characters, a lot of them in the form of sort of older adults that may or may not be sort of kind or sinister. I was going to ask you to maybe just tell everyone a little bit about Southern Aurora from a plot point of view, just enough to orient everyone around the characters, because my main question is, how do you sort of create the characters beyond that main voice? So Jimmy's obviously the place that you start. Are the characters purely there to serve Jimmy and sort of help you bring his character out and be the fullest that it can be? Or do you actually sit down and think about each character and what characters there are? Like, how sort of planned is it versus how do they just appear and become part of the fabric of Jimmy's story?
Yeah. So Jimmy, I'll do my kind of pitch for the story for those who haven't read it. So Jimmy's this kid growing up on the poorest street in a small town in the mid-1980s. And when we meet him, his life is really about to change, because his older brother is just about to get out of jail, and as you mentioned earlier, there's a billy cart race at his school that he's absolutely desperate to win. Meanwhile, his mum has a new boyfriend, and this guy's a bit erratic, has a bit of a short fuse. So Jimmy is really careful to try to do everything right when he's at home and in his life more broadly. So the story is essentially about Jimmy's attempts to kind of respond and overcome his circumstances, and I guess some of the tough life lessons that he learns along the way. So in terms of the other characters in his midst, there's his mum who is struggling a bit, this boyfriend, Charlie, who is, he's quite a complex character, I would say, and I was careful, I suppose. It can be a bit of a trap sometimes when you're writing some of these sinister, quote-unquote, characters, to make them just sinister and not present that light and shade. But we all know from our own lives that no one is ever purely bad or purely good. There's whole layers of complexity to everyone. So I wanted to bring that to the characters in this story too. The friendships that Jimmy has are really important, and I suppose I wanted to, like, when I think back to Wimmera, that was a thing that I really loved writing in Wimmera, was about this friendship between Ben and Fab. And there's something about those childhood friendships, they're of a particular intensity, I think, that isn't really repeated later in life. Like, your mates when you're young are sort of your whole world. And that's the situation for Jimmy. And there's kind of this shifting dynamic which occurs with his best mate, Danny, and this new kid on the block, Chadwick, who's kind of from a wealthy background and has all the nice stuff. And so there's this shifting world occurring for Jimmy. The other aspect which was of interest to me is the sibling dynamic as well, because Jimmy has a younger brother named Sam who has a disability. He's a couple of years younger than Jimmy, and Jimmy really looks after him and takes on this very nurturing role, but Sam's also kind of a confidant for Jimmy in his life, and a really important support. So I liked writing their relationship. Then he's got his older brother, Mick, who's about 8 years older, and he looks up to him, but he's also a little bit fearful of him given past history. So that's essentially the world that he's operating in. And I suppose that sibling relationship was something, again, which is probably of interest to me when I reflect on my own upbringing, because my parents were running the hotel, they were often very, very busy. And so I spent a lot of time with my older brothers, a couple of whom are here tonight, so I won't say anything bad about them. But they were really important relationships to me growing up. So that sibling relationship wasn't something that I've ever written about before. So I wanted to bring some of that to this book too. And I should mention as well the character of Don, who is the former bus driver, who is sort of, he takes on a bit of a kind of a nurturing role of Jimmy as well. So those are the sort of main players, I guess. In terms of how I develop them, or are they in service of the plot or of, progressing Jimmy along through the narrative, I never really think about that, Sarah. I just start writing this story. There's this great quote from William Faulkner, the great American writer, who said, writing is easy because you just make up these characters and then you just follow them around and write down what they do. And he was being facetious to a degree, but I think there's an element of truth to that too. That's what I find, because I don't know, in any of the books that I've written, only 4 so far, but in any of them, I don't really know what's going to happen, you know? And I'll be thinking ahead to the next chapter, the next scene, what might happen then. And then by the time I get there, sometimes I think, oh no, that won't happen because this character's different than what I thought he would be. He's changed. So I don't know the story as I'm writing. I don't know the ending. There are often things that develop and come as a surprise to me once I'm done. So it's, that's partly why I enjoy writing, you know, because it is a surprise. It is, and that's what keeps it interesting. And I know that there's authors around who meticulously plot everything out, and you know, I'm not knocking them. That's fine for how they want to do it.
How dare you? No, I don't do that either.
No, well, I mean, it's a different way of approaching it, and it's probably, you know, a lot more efficient way of doing it too. There's fewer drafts and fewer manuscripts put into the bottom drawer, but I like writing this way.
Yeah, so it's so funny. It's almost like this incredible power that you have as an author just to walk through and write it how you want to write it. But it is really interesting because I was thinking about this book in particular, and, you know, for example, if Jimmy had have had a sister and not a brother, or if Sam hadn't have been sort of, I guess, more vulnerable, it would have made Jimmy's character different because he would have been reacting to different circumstances. So every decision you're making, even if it's not conscious and your mind's kind of working faster than you are, it does really shape that character in the end as well, and the plot too. So it's just an amazing kind of process, and as you say, really interesting how different everyone writes because they all end up with a book. Yeah. But a completely different process to get there.
Well, and then there's the interaction with the reader. So like once the book's done and goes out into the world, like we as authors fade into the background, you know, notwithstanding events like this. We're not there to explain why a character's doing something or whatever. The reader has to have their own relationship with the book. And that's part of what I love about having my work published is you'll go to events and you'll have readers come up to you and have a completely different interpretation from the reader who was behind them of a character, and or what happened plot-wise. You'll have different interpretations. So it's a great experience, and it's partly what I love about reading is I'll pick up a book and I like to have that space to go into the book, to see that world, to try to understand those characters, and, you know, then talk to someone else about the book as well and see what they thought. It's just it's a really great medium.
Yeah, everyone's bringing all of their own things to each book that they read, and characters will sort of, I guess, they'll resonate in different ways because of people they know and all that sort of stuff as well.
And there's no like right or wrong interpretation of a book. And I often think about visual art is a very different medium to what we do, but if you go into a gallery and look at an artwork, you'll have your kind of instinctive response to that. And you'll think, oh, I like that, and I'm not sure why, or I don't really understand it, but I like it, or I don't like it. And often then you'll look at the little plaque underneath and read the explanation of what the work was intended to be, or what the motivation was. And I think about events like this as being a little bit like that. It's almost as though I'm offering that little plaque, I suppose, to explain some of the motivations or the atmosphere into which I'm writing, and to the extent that can, I guess, offer a reader a different perspective on my work.
Yeah, it's nice. Just a little reminder too, in about 15 minutes we'll have some audience questions. So Mark's brothers are very encouraged to ask questions if they would like. But no, everyone can ask a question. So if you've got something that you want to ask Mark, maybe start to have a think about that. Mark, this is another sad book. Oh. And we've talked a lot about you writing sad books over the years. You've got family violence. There's lots of sort of class dynamics in this story. Jimmy struggles a lot with, I guess, his position in life. There's addiction. there's education gaps, there's all kinds of different themes in your stories. I know you've sort of said already you're not a plotter, but are you conscious of the fact that A, you write sad books, and B, do you think about how the themes are being sort of orchestrated as you're writing? Like, is there sort of a perspective, I guess, you have on the cadence of how heavy-handed you're being, especially through the eyes of a child? I'm assuming a lot of it is observational, but it is pretty important that even if they're not understanding exactly what they're seeing, that the reader is understanding what is actually going on.
Yep.
Are you conscious of that, I guess, is the question, and how do you sort of make sure that you're not getting political in your writing, but you're sort of setting it up so that it, again, services the characters?
Yeah, look, you never want to become didactic in your writing. I think, and again, it goes back to my reading experience too. When I'm reading a book, and if I get the sense that an author is trying to teach me a message or tell me something about the world, I don't like it, you know. I want to draw my own inferences from a work. I don't set out to write books with any particular message. In saying that, I'm conscious, and it's more in hindsight, of the atmosphere into which I'm writing, or some of the things that I've been thinking about that are sort of in the background, I guess, and some of those issues of disadvantage, which I think have been in all my books, but perhaps in this book are more in the foreground than the others, with the exception probably of the Rip. The Rip was very different again. But I am interested in those issues more broadly. I don't want to be telling people what to think about my work, but we're increasingly becoming a very unequal society, and some of these issues, which I suppose are in the background of Southern Aurora, which is set in the 80s, are even more critical now. Issues around domestic violence. What is it like? A woman's killed every 10 days by her intimate partner in Australia. Issues around income inequality. We're now more unequal than most countries in the OECD. Housing is just incredibly unaffordable, and these problems are getting worse. And what happens to characters, to bring it back to the book, in this situation, is that it becomes very, very difficult to escape from sometimes very dangerous people in their midst. And this is not something which is the, I guess, the sole focus of fictional work. This is a reality of life, really, that a lot of people find it very, very hard to escape their situation. And all it takes is one or two things going wrong in their life and the whole thing can be derailed. So I suppose I'm conscious of those issues. I don't set out to write sad books, I hope.
I was sort of teasing you, but...
Yeah, I know. But I in this book, I think there is probably more of a note of hope, perhaps, than my other books. But I never want to have that false uplift either, which is something I really... I'm not going to name names of authors, but I don't like in a book when you get that kind of, that false note at the end. That, I'm not saying everything's happily ever after, but it just doesn't ring true. And it's not even about characters, it's about ringing true about life, because life doesn't work out like that. But I love the idea too, and I remember one of my teachers that I had at RMIT had this great description of the best endings of novels and of short stories. And she said that, you know, the best endings, they're like gateways through which you might see the world a little bit differently at the end. And that's all I really hope for in my books. But, you know, some readers pick up my books and just will read it like the previous novels, more as literary crime or more as a crime story and things like that, or read it just for entertainment's value or as a distraction from the day-to-day life, and that's completely fine. Like, I don't want anyone to feel like they have to have learned something from reading my books.
Yeah. No, I think, you know, you mentioned this before, but I think you do a really lovely job of... there's a sense of foreboding, definitely, in the story, because the way Jimmy sees the adults in the world, as an adult reading it, you're seeing a bit further ahead than he is. So he's describing enough for you to sort of feel quite concerned about what he's perhaps not aware of. But it's also not stereotypical, you know, and unfortunately a lot of these circumstances that you do write within have elements of, you know, archetypes to them, because there is sort of a bit of a formula to some of these horrible things, but your characters have got nuance and layers, and they're their own people as well, good and bad and everything in between. So I think you never get that sense of it being too preachy or too specific. It's just a story, and there's people coming in and out of that story, and Jimmy is the sort of the eyes of what you're seeing. So you definitely don't get preachy, don't worry.
Thanks, Sarah.
You touched on this a little bit yourself just then, but when we first met, our books were coming out at the same time, and we were both very firmly placed in the crime bucket. I think probably even the crime thriller bucket, maybe. And it made sense for my books because they've got a detective as the main character, so it's pretty kind of crimey. But with yours, that was a crime story in that there was, you know, murder in it and death and all of that sort of stuff that kind of puts it on those particular bookshelves. But since then, it sort of felt like you've edged further and further away from crime, and certainly the industry's also sort of put you into a few different categories. What kind of books do you think you write?
I never, ever think about genre at all. Like, when I wrote my first book, Wimmera, and I think I've told you this story before, I didn't see it as being crime or even literary crime. I just thought it was a story about these kids and things that happened to them in their life. And then my publisher, my fantastic publisher, Hachette, they sort of said, you know, we're going to market it as crime, and it was following the footsteps really of Jane Harper's The Dry. So the tagline went, if you love The Dry, you'll love Wimmera. And I was not prepared for this at all. And so I hadn't read any crime novels in my life. And so I quickly went out and bought a whole lot. I bought The Dry first and read that, and tried to sort of get across. And once Sarah's books came out, I read Sarah's books because they're fantastic.
Lucky.
But I wasn't really prepared for that at all.
You did also win a crime award, so that probably didn't help, probably.
Yeah, and I think too, like my professional background too, because I'd worked in the justice system, I'd studied criminal justice, like it all kind of worked into pushing it in that direction. But I've got no issue with that because, as you know, crime readers are voracious readers. They'll read a lot of books. And being kind of having my previous books classified as literary crime, it's kind of walked both sides of the street in a way, because I've had literary readers pick up my books, and also just pure crime
it's like
readers
you're bisexual,
too.
Basically. You get to be a bit of both. I've got another question for you. I've got a little smiley face after this question, actually, which is funny for me. Do you like writing? This is the kind of question I'd ask over like a dinner, and Mark would be like, oh, God.
I've got a complicated relationship I think, with writing.
Did you like writing this book? Because you said Jimmy was one of your favourite characters. So.
I did enjoy writing this book. When I first started writing, I loved it because it wasn't doing an office job anymore. So it was kind of like I could be my own boss, and I thought this is great, And I still love that side of it. Some aspects are great, as you know, when it's flowing quite well, it's like magic. There's nothing better, but it's hard too. It's hard, and it's really solitary work. It's incredibly unhealthy. You're sort of sitting down a lot, spending a lot of time in your own head, which probably isn't the best thing. I suppose as I've gone along, and now into my working on my fifth book, I think I have a healthier relationship to writing than what I had at the start. At the beginning, I kind of thought I have to be working all the time, and if I don't get this next book done, and if it's not good, and if it doesn't do well, I'm somehow a failure, and this has all not been worthwhile. I don't think like that anymore. I try to have a bit more balance in my life, spend time with friends and family, go for long walks, and just try to enjoy things a little bit more. I'm full of admiration for writers who can, produce a book every year of really high quality. I don't know how they do it. Chris Hammer, how does he writes these
he's AI.
I think he's AI as well, or he's got a team of authors behind. Because he writes these huge books, and they're really anyway.
Obviously a fraud of some kind.
I digress.
It's all right, we know Chris, he's lovely.
Yeah, and Sarah, even yourself, you've had a quite prolific output, and I don't know how you manage it. I find, I like writing, but I find it a very, very draining experience too. When I get out the other side of it, I'm just like, oh my God, thank God that's over.
Well, I had a question here that says, when you type the end and finish a book, when everything's done, how do you feel? And that's just drained is the answer.
Yeah, there's a moment probably, however many drafts in, where I know that it's done, more or less done. Yeah. Not done, but the fundamentals of the plot and the characters are all there. And when I get to that point, I do feel a bit emotional actually at that point, because you've been inside this world with these characters for so long, and you finally feel as though you've gotten it to the point that you're revealing something that you sometimes didn't know you wanted to reveal, and have found some truth in there, and that you've done their story justice. And that's a really satisfying moment. That's probably more satisfying than anything else. Yeah. It's more satisfying than getting your book published. It's more satisfying than awards, sales, anything.
It's so much work, and it's the culmination of knowing that it was able to be finished. I guess.
And you've finally got it there.
Done.
That's It's like anything. It's nothing. I think particular about writing in that respect. It could be if you're a carpenter and working on a piece of furniture or whatever. When you get it done, there's a feeling of satisfaction that you've gotten it done, and you've done it well with the skills that you've got at that point, the best that you could do it, and that's all I hope to do.
This is probably my last question, because I want to give everyone else a chance to ask some questions as well, but you're obviously at the opposite end of that process with a new book that you just mentioned yourself, so I'm going to ask you about it as well. You are writing something new. Is there anything that you can tell us about that at all? No. Is it in any way... is it a comedy?
Yeah, it's a romp. It's a romantic comedy. No.
Rom-com, no.
I wouldn't know how to describe it yet.
Okay.
So I wouldn't... If I said anything about it, it might change many, many times before it finds its way into the world, you know. So.
And just in terms of what you were saying before, because you're more character-based, not sort of like a plot person, is it that all of your initial, like when you sort of in your mind say, I'm working on a new book, is that code for I have a character and a voice that I'm starting to play around with?
Yeah.
Is that sort of what that means?
Yeah, pretty much. So I've got sort of like those opening few scenes involving the character, and that's sort of where I'm up to. I don't, and I'm lucky that I don't get a lot of pressure from my publisher about, you know, I mean, I've got a contractual date I have to deliver it by, but that my publisher's never on my back sort of saying, oh, what are you writing this time, or anything like that. It's all very open-ended, which is lovely, and I think that's probably partly the benefit of having some wonderful people to work with, but also because my stuff hasn't fit neatly into a genre, there's a little bit more flexibility, I think.
Yeah, and they trust you because you've written 4 books and they've all been great.
Oh, well, we'll see. The next one might be terrible, Sarah. So.
Unlikely, I think. I would love to sort of hand over to the audience now and see if anyone else has a question to ask of Mark. I've got more if we run out, but I'm sure there must be some questions out there. There's a microphone coming to you.
Oh, thank you. Mark, you said that you wrote the first draft of this in 2015, then you put it in the bottom drawer. What did you see in it when you came back to it that you didn't see before, having gone through, written another 2 books in the interim, and what enabled you to create a novel out of that first draft? Yeah,
thanks, Mark. That's Mark Smith, who's a brilliant YA author. Thanks for asking me that difficult question. What did I see? I think what I saw most of all was the appeal of the character, the appeal of Jimmy, and in terms of how I could make it work, it was probably more those plot aspects that I was able to navigate a bit more. I think I understood where the points of tension were in the manuscript. That's probably the best way I can summarise it. And some of the characters which were more at the periphery, I brought closer into the story, and they became more pivotal. Probably the most important one of those was Don, the bus driver, and his involvement in the story. So in the earlier drafts, he was much more in the background, a much smaller character. And as I think you've read, he's now just a really crucial character to the story. I think those earlier drafts too were talking about like sad stories. It was much sadder back then. It was really sad. Like, it's still a bit sad, but it was really, really, really sad.
To write out all of that.
Yeah. Well, no, it was a very depressing story. it was how it was. So I think I probably came back at it with a bit more of a. It was partly the benefit of having written the other books, but it was partly just a bit more of an optimistic view of the characters and what they might do in a given situation. So the point at which I wrote that, which, as I said, was after Wimmera, just after Wimmera. Wimmera hadn't been published. I just think I was not yet... I had plenty of enthusiasm, but I didn't yet have the full suite of skills, I suppose, and discipline too, to actually get it done, and to keep working at it and to leave it and go back to it. I think I was probably a little bit exhausted by the experience of writing Wimmera too, because that was it was quite a complicated plot for a first book, like with a major shift in time, and it took a lot out of me writing that. It really did. So, I think I probably would have benefited from having a longer break, really, after finishing that.
Another question?
I'm astounded that you can commence writing a book without a clear plot or narrative in mind. So for the non-authors in the room, firstly, is this industry practice? And secondly, do you ever think, could this book have taken a different shape if, given your mood or life circumstance of the day, or, another type of narrative could have come to play?
I don't know if it would be industry norm. I think everyone's process is different.
I think some people too don't plot at all start, but then sort of get to a certain point and then sort of start to frantically plot the second half because they don't know what happens. And there's sort of like different, I think, approaches overall, but it's definitely not standard.
No. So some people have a bit more of a hybrid kind of approach, I would say. As to whether my moods impact what I'm writing, undoubtedly, and my state of mind at different times affects what I write. But I think a lot of that gets ironed out in the redrafting of a work. So I can identify where, maybe I might have had a bit of a sort of a negative view about a particular character at that time, when I go back and redraft it, and then I think, oh no, hang on, this isn't quite working. This person needs to be a little bit more like this. But that I guess, more directive approach toward those characters is more about the peripheral characters, if that makes sense. The main characters are pretty well formed in my head about what sort of people they are. And so as they sort of butt up against these different situations that the plot asks them to do, you come to know them more and more through the writing of the manuscript. I remember there's this great quote I read years ago. I can't remember the name of the author. He's an American author. I'm just quoting American authors again and again. I shouldn't be doing that. But he talked about characters as being, at the beginning of a story, sort of wrapped up in layers and layers of clothing. And as you work through the narrative, piece by piece, a layer is removed and removed and removed, until by the end you know them, like, as he put it, they're naked, and there is, like, God would know them, and you know them, like, really, really intimately. And I think that's kind of true of my process in a lot of ways. I'm just sort of peeling away layers until I really know who the character is, and by the end I sort of arrive at that. And so that's really like part of the motivation for why I write, I guess. You sort of start with this incoherent or sort of a bit fuzzy view of a character, and then by the end it's like crystal clear. You know exactly the sort of person that they are.
I don't think we have time for any more questions unless anyone's got a super quick one. I think there's a hand in the air there.
At the front.
Just has to be relatively quick.
Thank you, Mark. You mentioned the influence of growing up in the country to your novels, and I was just curious to know about the influence of your time working in the justice system as well, particularly in the characters.
Yeah, I think sort of. So the question was around the influence of my professional background, working in the justice system. So that was where I spent most of my professional life before I became sort of a lazy author. And so I worked at Department of Justice for about 10 years, and I had some really great jobs there, some really interesting jobs too. I'd say that the most interesting job that I had was working as a political advisor to the Corrections Minister, the former Corrections Minister, Tim Holding. And I spent, I think, two and a half years working for Tim. And I learned more in those 2.5 years than the rest of my time in the Justice Department combined. And my particular area of responsibility was corrections and emergency services I had. So I came to know a lot about the prison system, more than I cared to know, really, in a lot of ways. And I guess it does influence some of what I write, because you see a particular cohort cycling through the justice system again and again and again, and often, and not always, but often it is through the kind of circumstances that people are born into, and they end up with, you know, some kind of very negative influences in their life, and they go in a particular direction. And once you have contact with the justice system, you often have repeated contact throughout your life. That's the way it goes. So that certainly influences some of the themes that underpin my writing in a more direct way. Like the writing of Wimmera was definitely influenced by that time, because one of our particular areas of concern was the management of sex offenders in the community, and particularly child sex offenders. And it's not a spoiler about the book. The book's been out for a few years now, I think. But it was kind of responding to some of those issues. I think I had a lot of stuff that I'd read and was really was kind of unprocessed, I suppose, from that time, that I then, unbeknownst to me, was trying to make sense of in the writing of this book. And so it definitely came out onto the page. So that stuff, you know, all of that life experience, professional experience, it definitely, you know, it comes out on the page, whether you like it or not.
I think that's all we have time for. Thank you all so much for coming tonight and listening to Mark talk about his book, Southern Aurora. Thank you to the Wheeler Centre for having us, and to Melbourne City Reads for supporting this event and for supporting Mark's book. Hill of Content are down the back corner, ready to receive all of your purchases of the book, and Mark will sign his book. And if you've got any other questions, I'm sure he'll be happy to answer them while he's trying to sign the book at the same time, so hit him up with that. But yeah, thanks so much for coming. It's been lovely to talk to everyone.